Speaking of that, Tom, can you walk us through how walkthroughs is set up? Because having looked at some of those visuals, I do find them very concise and clear in terms of the steps that a teacher sh could take or should take to be effective in how they're doing that certain things. Could you take us through that?
So basically, when I wrote the book, I was thinking, well, and I've done training on this many, many times on all these things. And some of the ideas are taken from Doug Lamoff's Teach Like a Champion. Some are taken from my own ideas. Some are borrowed from other areas. They're just well-known ideas. So if you take something like a turn and talk, or we call it think, pair, share, which is another one, like a classic turn to your partner. How do you make it so that both children in a pair have to talk and share? So you break them down into steps. So the first thing you need to do is make sure everyone has a talk partner. And that sounds so obvious. And we spell out the obvious. So we make it to a benefit. It's not, we're never above the obvious in teaching. Lessons stand or fall on doing really obvious things really well. So if I want to make sure everyone has a talk partner, I have to do that. Then you have to think of pose a question which has got some structure to it. Because if you're going to have pair talk, a simple question will get a simple answer, and that's not really worth discussing. So you have a question which has got a bit of structure to it, like coming up with 3 advantages and 3 disadvantages or something specific like that, and a bit of a time frame for that so the children know how long they have to talk. A third step is that you then give the children thinking time on their own first. So before they share their ideas, they've got to think of their own. Otherwise, one child just hears the other's ideas first and it stops them thinking, in fact. So thinking on your own, then share. The fourth step is the teacher then circulates as the children are sharing so that they can listen in and check it's happening and get some sense of what the children are talking about. And the fifth step is that you then pool the answers into the collective, the whole class, through cold calling, so that the teacher selects children and says, hey, so John, what were you saying in your pair? How did you get on? And invites the children to share certain answers. So that's the structure. And when you break it down in that way, you go beyond just saying, am I doing turn and talks? It's much more precise than that. And it's much more sort of, who are the talk partners? Are they effective? What questions are good for think, pair, share? Was it a good question? We get way into the detail, the precision, the specifics of it, and it makes it much more effective in the long run. Because if you just say to somebody, are you doing turn and talks in your lesson? They'll say, yes. So how's it going? Pretty good. We just don't get very far with that type of surface exploration. It's got to be much more precise. That's the idea of a walkthrough. It gives you a framework for thinking about your practices with some detail. What it isn't, I should say this, it's not like a law. Those things are frameworks for thinking about a good process. And it's a good process if you follow it. But you might have all sorts of reasons to not exactly do that at any given time or with a particular class or a particular subject. So we have to be careful not to treat a walkthrough as absolute truth or the rules you must follow or else. It's just, here's a nice set of ideas that will help you think about this technique in some detail and use it to self-reflect and to improve your practice and for coaching.
You said a lot there that resonated with me, Tom. So, no, I agree with you actually in terms of the obvious isn't necessarily the obvious because one, I've gone into many classrooms and recommended Think, Pair, Share and have found myself and the teacher also going to certain students and saying, do you have a partner? Especially if students are spread out
Yeah.
across the room because they're not necessarily going to take the initiative to get up and go, oh, I'm going to go walk over and find a partner. So, yes, I agree that there is nothing too obvious in teaching. And then you were also saying that walkthroughs is not necessarily quote unquote a law, and that sometimes you have to amend and adapt things for your audience. So, another strategy I like very similar to Think, Pair, Share is think write pair share because sometimes students
Mm.
need that time to self-reflect beyond just think where they're actually writing it down and calming down and writing what they need to write and then turn and talk to each other. I found that it sometimes helps ground some student groups that need, or some students that need that. And as you were talking, Tom, I was also thinking what I should have also asked you is how do you break up walkthroughs? Like, are there certain, not like in Danielson we call them domains.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you like how you break up in walkthroughs your different elements or best elements of practice. Could you tell us a little bit more about those different indicators of good practice? And for example, where would turn and talks fit within this model or this framework?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, so we definitely organize it into domains. So we have 6 domains in our framework. So the first one is behavioral relationships. We start off with establishing expectations and positive relationships and techniques like positive framing, which I'm a big fan of, where you turn corrective language into positive language. So instead of saying, John and Tom, will you stop talking and listen? you say, Tom, John, looking, listening, thanks. And it's just super positive. You don't tell them off. And that's the positive framing. So that's one set of ideas. Running the room, there's lots of ones like that. So it's a manual on behavior management right in there. Then we have curriculum. So before we get into the classroom, what's our curriculum design? So we have a whole domain around curriculum planning. And there's quite a lot of walkthroughs in there, but they're slightly different from the ones which are like how do I do this step by step in the lesson? They're things to think about when you're planning the curriculum. And it includes things like establishing learning objectives for individual lessons, but sequences of lessons, but also how you sequence the curriculum over time and ideas about difficulty and so on. And then we get into explaining and modeling. So you're setting out a set of ideas, how you explain things, modeling and scaffolding. So that's a whole other area, the kind of input, if you like, from a teacher typically. The fourth section is to do with questioning and feedback. So this is where we include think, pair, share. So questioning and feedback, the formative assessment, the in-class dynamic, responsive feedback where you hear an answer and you develop it and so on, but also feedback in a wider sense, like to do with grade marking books and other aspects of assessment are built into that. The fifth section is a practice and retrieval. So this is to do with memory and consolidation and testing, quizzing, but also practice, meaning guided practice, independent practice. And the sixth section is one which is based on my previous book, my first proper teaching book, which is called The Learning Rainforest. And in The Learning Rainforest, I invented this thing called Mode A and Mode B teaching to capture the fact that instructional teaching is only part of a whole set of things you do as a teacher. It's a big part of it, but there's other things that children do to make a really nice, rich curriculum experience, like, for example, occasionally doing an independent project where they find things out for themselves through reading and study and research. That's not a way that you base your education around that process, but it's a thing that you might do occasionally, or giving a speech or a presentation to the class, or having a debate in the lesson, that type of thing. So all these sort of occasional set piece things you plan to develop and enrich the curriculum, which usually involve more student agency and then doing things more for themselves. That's called Mode B teaching. So there's a whole section in our walkthroughs called Mode B teaching, and all those ideas are included there. So those are the 6 sections.